This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW. Written and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is flyer number 155, entitled Menfairing Manifesto for Japan. Description. This flyer is indirectly addressed to the Japanese Minister for Population and Gender Equality, suggesting measures to persuade men to stop rejecting paternity that has already caused Japan's population to decline. The two main measures are the push to make Japanese women FIPs, that's FIP, financially independent persons, and to menfair the gender laws. Then Japanese men will be more inclined to be fathers. The flyer itself, Menfairing Manifesto for Japan. Why Japan? Because Japan has been the most affected by the MGTOW/Masculist's strongest argument to force the gender politicians to menfair the gender laws, or the MGTOW/Masculists will continue to wipe out whole populations by continuing to reject paternity, thus crashing the birth rate. Japan is about a decade ahead of the US in terms of its young men rejecting the traditional manslave role to pay for women. I lived in Japan for 8 years in the 90s and remember how dispirited the salarymen were coming home late after work with their 11-hour days, 3-hour average commute times, handing over their paychecks to their tennis-playing fluffy housewives, getting no sex from them, being strangers to their kids because they get home too late. I used to think, what a shitty existence. Why do these Jap males tolerate such a half-life? I left Japan early in 2000. Since then, the younger Japanese generation of men have rebelled. They reject the traditional manslave salaryman role and refuse to work for women. They reject the salaryman role of being a wage slave, stuck in the same company for life, unable to get out of it. They often refuse to date or sex women, preferring to amuse themselves with their video games, etc. A decade ago, about a third of young Japanese men under 35 were rejecting paternity. Now it's more like 70%, similar to the US figure. The US is catching up to the situation in Japan, but started about a decade later. Because Japan has been facing the herbivore men situation, that is, the Japanese equivalent of MGTOW/Masculism, for a lot longer, more Japanese politicians are now aware that these young Japanese men have the power to wipe Japan off the map due to Japan's crashing birth rate, which is now only 1.4 children per woman, compared to the replacement rate of 2.1. Japanese demographers have calculated that in a few decades, once the Japanese baby boomers have died off, the Japanese population will have fallen by a third, taking it to about 80 million. Today's Japanese population is already falling. At its peak, it was 128 million, and has fallen by 1 million in just a few years to 127 million. If the current trend continues, then in a mere century, do the math, there will be no more Japan. A similar logic holds for the US and comparable countries. Recently, the Japanese government appointed a Minister of State for Measures for Declining Birth Rate and Minister of State for Gender Equality, whose name is Haruko Arimura. So the ko means that it's a woman. I'll give you the link, it's not too long. So Japan.Kantei, that's Kantei, .go, which I guess is short for government, .jp/96_ABE/Meibo, that's MEIBO/Daijin, that's DAIJIN/. He took a traditionalist approach, in brackets, not surprisingly for a Japanese, a people not known for their creativity, scoring on average a standard deviation and a half below comparably developed countries on creativity tests. In parentheses, says Professor Lynn, that's Lynn, Google him, the Irish psychometrician. by trying to shame young Japanese men to man up, face your paternal responsibilities. Young Japanese men ignored him because his message utterly missed the point. He failed to get to the heart of the problem, which is young Japanese men utterly rejecting the man-slave salaryman role. To persuade young men to be fathers again, there will have to be some major social restructuring in Japan, which is what this flyer is about. Arimura-san, so I guess I'm addressing, to say son in Japanese is a form of respect. That means you're addressing yourself to them. Arimura-san, so talking to the Minister of State. The Japanese Minister of State for measures for declining birth rate and Minister of State for gender equality. We'll need to push for two major reforms in Japan, namely A, forcing Japanese women to share the burden of earning the living by becoming FIPs, that's FIP, financially independent persons, so that Japanese men can work a lot less hard and enjoy their kids. And B, menfairing the gender laws so that men do not feel they are being targeted negatively by society and hence will be more willing to marry and have kids. These two major reforms can be broken down into less major components. Forcing women to become FIPs, financially independent persons, will imply a revolution in education for women. Most women feel today that they can afford to be mentally lazy because they think they can always parasite off a man-slave when they're in their 30s and wanting to have kids and live in a middle-class apartment that the man-slave husband pays for. This is especially true in ultra-conservative Japan, where gender roles are about half a century behind the West. But even in the US, more than 80% of young women 16 years old in high school, as in Japan, choose to be fluffy crappers, that is, studying fluffy crap, that is, the soft option, that is, non-math, non-sciences. So they will be forced to study fluffy crap at university, and hence not be able to earn a good salary, the way they would have if they had been career competent and studied math and sciences at high school. These fluffy crappers then look for some manslave to parasite upon in their 30s because they can't afford to pay for their own middle-class apartment. These fluffy crappers choose to be parasites at age 16, where most of the fluffy crapper damage is done. The minister needs to promote a publicity campaign to persuade women to become FIPs, shaming them if they don't, and threatening them with being babyless if they are not FIPs, because young men refuse to be manslave salarymen anymore. He can use masculinist slogans such as, "Be FIP or be manless," "No calculus, no baby," "Fluffies rot on the shelf," "Fluffy crappers will be manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, poor and socially rejected." Teachers and parents need to be targeted in this government-sponsored publicity campaign to encourage, push, threaten and frighten young women to become FIPs. Strong moral pressure needs to be put on them. Journalists and media people need to be targeted to help spread the message. It can be done. Look what Stalin did to Russian women in the Soviet era. Russia churned out huge numbers of female engineers and scientists, etc. Women are only a few IQ points dumber than men on average, so are quite capable of studying the hard option, that is, math and the sciences, at high school, so as to become FIPs as adults. Calculus and science should be made compulsory at 12th grade high school. Teachers need to push young women to aim to be FIPs and frighten them that they'll be babyless unless they push themselves to become career competent at high school, where the real fluffy crapper problem starts. By the time Japanese women go to university, most of the damage has already been done because the STEM, science, tech, engineering, math, departments at university reject fluffy crappers from entering their majors. Parents should pressure their daughters from an early age that women have a moral responsibility to become FIPs, or men will reject them, seeing them as immoral, parasitic, man-slaving vermin to be wiped out. The minister can push for the interviewing of prominent Japanese herbivore men on broadcast national media to explain to Japanese society why the herbivores are going on strike against marriage and paternity. Japanese society needs to be taught what the problem is so that millions of Japanese understand what needs to be done. Without understanding the problem, nothing will get fixed. The other major reform that the minister needs to bring in is the menfairing of the gender laws. Arimura-san is not just Minister of Population, but also Minister of Gender Equality. He needs to bring in many equalities for men, especially in the divorce courts. Alimony should be thrown out. Custody of kids should go automatically to both parents. Parents should be encouraged to buy a cheap apartment near the main apartment and alternate in both, with one parent staying with the kids in one apartment while the other parent stays in the cheap nearby apartment, and the following week they swap places. Another major piece of legal reform that is needed is to bring in the paternity rejection right, so that men have the same right as women to reject an unwanted pregnancy. Women have had the maternity rejection right in many countries since the 70s. Japan has had it since 1948 to abort babies born of black American soldier fathers during the US occupation of Japan after World War II. Mulatto babies were shipped off to the Japanese settlements in South America. I kid you not. The lack of a para, whereby a man whose girlfriend gets accidentally pregnant on purpose by forgetting, in quotes, to take the pill, can have his life ruined by being forced to pay for a kid that he never wanted in the first place. The existence of a mara and the non-existence of a para anywhere in the world is a blatant sexually discrimination against men, and makes the masculists extremely angry enough to threaten their countries with extinction by rejecting paternity to the point that their populations get wiped out within a century. A para in practice would take the form of an unwanting father-to-be being able to sign a legal form rejecting paternity, so that if the mother goes ahead with the pregnancy, then she is legally obliged to pay the full cost of the kid until it grows up. There are many other legal discriminations against men, e.g. differences in retirement ages, more money spent on female cancers than male cancers. The pro-female bias in the media needs to be neutralized. In the army, men do combat, but not women. Men have shorter life expectancies than women by about 6 years, a lot of which is due to differences in gender roles, not biology. Men get heavier penalties than women for identical crimes, etc. The minister needs to menfair the gender laws across the board, systematically, thoroughly. When men feel that they're being treated fairly by the government and society, then they will be more likely to be fathers. They will not risk being financially massacred by the current fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts, so will look upon fatherhood with much less risk. Since nearly all women will be FIPs, the para becomes much more practical. On the other hand, if the minister and his successors do not turn women into FIPs and do not menfair the gender laws, then the herbivore men in Japan will keep doing what they're doing, that is, nothing, as far as women are concerned, avoiding them and not sexing them, so that the birth rate remains very low, thus continuing to wipe out the Japanese population. If the Japanese gender politicians do not FIPify, or FIP, the verb, women, and do not menfair the gender laws, then they will risk being assassinated by people taking the law into their own hands, reasoning that desperate times, that is, with the Japanese population crashing badly, require desperate measures. These future assassins of both sexes, men who want gender justice and women who want men to give them babies, will see the gender politicians as genocidal criminals and remove them violently. Flyers like this one need to be sent to the gender politicians of all countries so that their populations do not crash out of existence. There's a lot at stake here. Either the gender politicians give men what they want, that is, making women become FIPs and menfairing the gender laws, or the herbivore men will continue to wipe out the population by continuing to reject paternity. The ball is in the gender politicians' court. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name: De Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, flyers. Ciao.